Welcome to the Physiology class. Today's topic of discussion is cell membrane transport. Transport mechanism in the body is necessary for the supply of essential substances such as nutrients, water, oxygen, electrolytes, etc. and to remove the unwanted substances like waste materials, carbon dioxide, etc. from the tissue. The basic mechanism of transport are of three types. First one, passive transport mechanism. Second mechanism is active transport mechanism. And the third mechanism is vesicular transport mechanism. Each mechanism is again classified into two. Passive transport mechanism is again classified into simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Active transport mechanism is classified into primary active transport and secondary active transport mechanism. Vesicular transport mechanism is classified into exocytosis and endocytosis. First, we are going to study about passive transport mechanism. Passive transport is the transport of substances along the concentration gradient, electrical gradient, or both electrochemical gradient. During this, the substances move from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration. It is also known as diffusion or downhill movement. This process doesn't require energy. Passive transport or diffusion is of two types, that is simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion occurs through lipid layer and also through protein layer. Lipid soluble substances such as oxygen, carbon dioxide and alcohol are transported by simple diffusion through the lipid layer of cell membrane. Next one, simple diffusion through protein layer. There are specific protein channels that extend from cell membrane through which the simple diffusion takes place. Water soluble substances like electrolytes are transported through these channels. The protein channels are selectively permeable to only one type of ion. Accordingly, the channels are named after the ions diffusing through these channels, such as sodium channel, potassium channel, etc. Protein channels are of two types, that is gated channel and ungated channels. Ungated channels which are open continuously. Here you can see ungated channel. The gated channels which are closed all the time and are open only when required. Gated channels are divided into three categories, that is voltage gated channels, ligand gated channels and mechanically gated channels. What does voltage gated channels? These channels open by change in the electrical potential. For example, calcium channels present in the neuromuscular junction. Ligand-gated channels. These channels open in the presence of hormonal substances which are called ligands. Example, sodium channels which are opened by acetylcholine in neuromuscular junction. The last one is mechanically gated channels which are opened by some mechanical factors such as pressure and force. Example, sodium channel in the pressure receptors called Pacinian corpuscle. Second type of diffusion is facilitated or carrier mediated diffusion. In this type of diffusion, some carrier proteins help the transport of substances. The water-soluble substances with large molecules cannot pass through the protein channels by simple diffusion. Such substances are transported with the help of carrier proteins. This type of diffusion is faster than simple diffusion. Glucose and amino acids are transported by this method. This diagram is showing the transport of glucose from ECF to ICF with the help of carrier protein. And this diagram showing osmosis. It is a special type of passive transport. What is the difference between diffusion and osmosis? Diffusion means it is the transport of substances from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration. But in osmosis, the transport of molecules, that means water molecules or solvents, are transported from the region of lower concentration to the region of higher concentration through a semi-permeable membrane. So, osmosis comes under a special type of passive transport. Next is about active transport mechanism. Active transport is the transport of substances against the chemical or electrical or electrochemical gradient. It is also called uphill transport. Active transport requires energy which is obtained mainly by breakdown of ATP. It also needs a carrier protein. And what is the difference between active transport and facilitated diffusion? Active transport requires energy, and at the same time facilitated diffusion doesn't require energy. And in active transport, substances are moved from the region of lower concentration to the region of higher concentration. But in facilitated diffusion, substances are moved from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration. Carrier proteins involved in the active transport are of two types: uniport, second one is symport or antiport. What is uniport? Uniport is the carrier protein that can carry only one substance in a single direction. It is also known as uniport pump. Second category of carrier protein is symport or antiport. Symport is the carrier protein that transports two different substances in the same direction. Antiport is the carrier protein that transport two different substances in opposite direction. And next we are moving on to the types of active transport. Active transport is of two types. First one, primary active transport. Second one is secondary active transport. And what is primary active transport? Primary active transport is the type of transport mechanism in which the energy is liberated directly from the breakdown of ATP. By this method, the substances such as sodium, potassium, calcium, hydrogen and chloride are transported across the cell membrane. The best example for primary active transport is sodium-potassium pump. This diagram explains sodium-potassium pump. Here we can see a carrier protein in the cell membrane. Three sodium ions from inside the cell is attached to the carrier protein. At the same time, two potassium ions from the ECF is attached to the outside of the cell membrane. When these ions are attached to the carrier protein, there are some conformation changes occurs. The ATP is split into ADP and high energy phosphate. With the help of this energy, 3 sodium ion from the ICF is moves out of the cell and 2 potassium ion from the ECF is moves into the or inside the cell. This is called sodium-potassium pump. Here you can see the transport of sodium and potassium across the cell membrane with the help of carrier protein. And what are the functions of sodium-potassium pump? It helps in controlling the cell volume. When sodium-potassium pump fails, the cell swells up and bursts. And another function is electrogenic activity. And the sodium-potassium pumpers act as an electrogenic pump since it produces a net movement of positive charge out of the cell. Thus, it creating a electrical potential across the cell membrane. This is called electrogenic activity. And this is the basic requirement in the nerve and muscles to transmit the signals. And what are the abnormalities related to sodium-potassium pump? These are the examples: cardiac failure and hypertension. Due to decreased number of sodium-potassium pump in the myocardium, cardiac failures occur. Hypertension occurs due to increased number of sodium-potassium pump in the renal tubule. Next is about secondary active transport mechanism. Secondary active transport is the transport of substances along with sodium ion by a common carrier protein. Secondary active transport is of two types, that is co-transport and counter-transport. And what is sodium co-transport? In this, along with the sodium, another substance is carried with the help of a carrier protein called symport. Example: transport of glucose, amino acid, chloride, etc. This diagram showing sodium co-transport. Next one is sodium counter-transport. In this process, the substances are transported across the cell membrane in exchange for sodium ions by the carrier proteins called antipode. Examples are sodium calcium countertransport and sodium hydrogen countertransport in the renal cells. And the last type of transport is vesicular transport. This mechanism involved in the transport of macromolecules which can neither pass through the membrane by diffusion nor by active transport mechanism. It includes two types of transport, that is endocytosis and exocytosis. Endocytosis is the transport mechanism by which the macromolecules enter the cell. The substances with larger molecules are called macromolecules, and these substances cannot pass through the cell membrane either by active or by passive transport mechanism. Such substances are transported into the cell by endocytosis. These are of three types: pinocytosis, phagocytosis and receptor-mediated endocytosis. Next is about exocytosis. It is a process by which the substances are expelled from the cell. In this process, the substances are extruded from the cell without passing through the cell membrane. This is the reverse of endocytosis. Examples for exocytosis are the release of hormones and enzymes. That's all about the transport across the cell membrane. Thank you.